Hello everybody, and today we're going to be in Chapter 9, which takes a look at evaluations. And today we're going to be looking primarily at feedback, evaluation feedback, and also performance feedback. We're also going to take a look at some issues that involve reliability and validity. We're going to go ahead and examine the difference between the two and why they're so important. So let's go ahead today and start with Chapter 9. Well, welcome back everybody, and today we're in Chapter 9, which deals with evaluating and reinforcing organization development interventions. Now, that's a long title, but really what it implies is making sure that whatever the OD intervention is working, that it is doing what it's supposed to be doing. If you remember when we looked at some of the fundamentals of using organizational development strategies, and when we were considering the individuals who would be a good fit for that organization to be able to implement development and change strategies, we saw where some were limited in what they were able to do. Oftentimes, because the nature of change is so broad and innocuous, we may not be sure of exactly what we want. We just want an end result. And a lot of times, we're not even sure what we want as an end result. When you hear phrases like, we need to improve productivity, or we need to improve morale, or we need to be more efficient, these words can be interpreted any number of ways. So it helps from the very beginning to be very specific. If you are the practitioner yourself, you need to ask those questions that are going to dig deeper than just what do you want. You need to ask specifically, what is it that you're looking for, and what expectations do you have? One of the ways that we have in measuring and to be able to assess the effectiveness of any organizational development protocol is by measuring and being able to get primarily feedback as we go along. And this is what this chapter talks about. So let's go ahead and get started with Chapter 9, which deals with assessing through feedback and the metrics that we're using, organizational development interventions. Now, as you see here, when we take a look at the implementation and evaluation feedback, these are two realms that this textbook really talks about here. Implementation is the feedback as you go along with the intervention. These are the milestones. These are the checks and balances that you want to implement throughout the course of the intervention. Evaluation feedback looks at how successful that intervention was, or those steps were. So you have two sections of feedback that are important throughout the OD span: implementation, and then you have evaluation. Also, measurement. Now, what are the considerations when it comes to measurement? Well, first of all, it goes without saying, you want to select the right variables to measure. When you are looking at maybe improving processes, then you want to be able to measure processes. If you're looking at behavioral issues, you want to be able to measure behavioral outcomes. So this is an important aspect, and we're going to talk about that also here in a little bit as we move along. But that's going to be important. Also, designing good measurements. What does it take to design a good measurement? Well, it needs to be workable. That means it needs to be operational. There needs to be procedures in place. There needs to be guidelines and so forth for that intervention and for the after intervention protocol. Reliable. And reliability means that you are going to yield consistent results time and time again. Valid is the authentication of that measurement or that intervention. Valid means that it is measuring what it's supposed to measure. So in your metric, if you're measuring the variables through your feedback, you need to make sure it's operational, that it's pertinent to whatever you're doing, it's reliable, it's yielding consistent results, and it's valid. And then, of course, you have the research design, and we're going to talk about that a little bit more tomorrow. Now, again, implementation and evaluation feedback. This is feedback aimed at guiding the implementation efforts. When you first get with your OD professional, there are going to be things that you're going to want as the leader of that organization. There are things that you're going to want to see accomplished. And working with that OD professional, you're going to be setting up, as we see here, milestones and intermediate targets. If you want to see a more efficient, streamlined process in your organization, then there needs to be checkpoints that you can measure. And again, that's being able to quantify your progress. And folks, that's very important because if you just say we need to improve our efficiency and I need to see some changes take place in the next 30 days, that can go any direction. You can do anything and do improvement. I mean, if you were to maybe save the company, $10 or $100 or $1,000, and you could arguably say, well, I made it more efficient, so I've done my job. So you need to have some specific expectations and those milestones and targets throughout the course of the implementation will help you to identify all of that. And then it's a measure of the intervention's progress. Now, here's what's important when we look at milestones. We have a term in management that we call management by objective. And that means we don't just put in hours to put in hours. We work to obtain objectives and goals. Your goal, let's say, would be in the next 6 months to increase productivity, or let's say increase efficiency by 60%. So every month you may evaluate progress towards that goal. Now, at the end of the first month, let's say, for instance, you have helped to create a process or a work technology or whatever to increase that efficiency by, let's say, 10%. Well, now we're going. We know we're headed in the right direction because we are seeing an increase in efficiency. But what about the second month and you don't see an increase? Well, at that point, you can sit back down with the OD professional and say, listen, the first month we were good, the second month not so good. So what's going on? You can go back and you can evaluate what's going on. What did you do in the first month that you might not have done in the second month? Was the first month a fluke? Was it something that was just because something was different? You naturally saw a reaction to that, but now things have stabilized and you're not seeing any growth or efficiency. It's better to know at the very earliest stage or stages when things are going right or going wrong, because if they're going wrong, you can stop and reevaluate and try something different without investing all this time and money. If it's going right, then you know you're headed in the right direction. You can continue on the way that you have been going. So measuring progress. These are all things that are done during the implementation phase. Now, in the evaluation phase, where you're doing feedback, this is feedback aimed at determining the impact of the intervention. Did those strategies work? What were the lessons learned? And here you're wanting to look at goals and outcomes and performance. After the 60 days, 90 days, 6 months, or whatever, if you reached your objective and you saw that increase in the right percentage of efficiency, then you can identify this is what we did. So knowing that this will result in a positive outcome we need to continue on with this strategy and these work behaviors and so forth. And it's a measure of the intervention's effect. So you can really validate the intervention itself by measuring what it did or what it didn't do, so that if something comes up in the future, you'll have a good idea of whether or not OD can help you, and if it does, you can encourage it even in your own organization. And listen, if it works, then you need to start developing your people in this area. There's a lot of people out there who pay a lot of money to these consultants who are doing exactly what we're doing right now. In fact, you can take these principles and you can go out and hang your shingle and be an OD practitioner once you have learned the methodologies of industrial and organizational design and psychology and those areas. But at least here you know the groundwork to be able to understand that, they're only doing what we're showing you here, going systematically, step by step, evaluating and getting feedback and assessing and all of those things that's necessary for you to be a successful OD practitioner. Now, this is just an overview of the system of implementation and evaluation feedback. It begins with diagnosis. Just like a doctor will diagnose a patient, so too do you diagnose whatever's going on with the organization. You do that through information. Data will provide you with what you need to be able to assess. And this is done, as we've seen before, through primary and secondary data. Primary data would be to go to the individuals or to see things firsthand. Secondary data, as you've seen, will go through research on literature and documentation and so forth. But here you have from there the implementation or design and implementation of an intervention. And then you go from there to the implementation of it, to the implementation feedback. And as you're going along here, you can see, you measure the intervention, clarify intentions, plan for next steps, evaluate the feedback, or you get the evaluation feedback once the intervention is complete. And then you have the measure of the long-term effects here. And then if the intervention here does not work, at this point, if there's a breakdown in the initial design, then you have alternative interventions that you can incorporate. But it's best to know at what point there's going to be a breakdown and you need to go and initiate an alternative intervention. You don't want to get down here and fail and then realize that, hey, we should have done something else. That's wasteful, and companies today can't afford to do that. So these diagrams that you see really follow along the same path. No matter which one you see throughout this book, they're all going to point back to diagnosing, designing, implementing, and evaluating. And if throughout the implementation, if you're evaluating, then if something is not going right, you can always fall back to an alternative intervention, and that will increase the chances that you'll have a successful OD intervention. Now, measurement. You want to select the appropriate variables. You want to design good measures, and what they indicate here from a rigorous operational definition is to provide precise guidelines for measurement. How high, for instance, does a team have to score on a 5-point scale to say that it is effective? So we see specifically, not how much does a team have to score to be good. Here we see how does a team have to score on a 5-point scale to say that it is not good but effective. Not does the team do well or how does the team do well. You're very specific, and this is what you need to be in the habit of developing: specific, rigorous operational definitions. Now again, when we go to reliability and validity. Reliability is the test that will be consistent. That means if I test a variable on a certain day and I use the same test with all conditions being the same, if I use the same test 3 months from now, I should still garner the same results. That means it's reliable. I can depend on it. Validity is the authentication of that measurement. That means it is measuring what it is supposed to measure. So reliability and validity are the two key components of a measurement endeavor. Now, sources of reliability, you have, again, the rigorous operational definition, and we saw that in the last slide. You have multiple methods to measure a particular variable that you can use: surveys, interviews, observations, unobtrusive measures, which is secondary data. You're going to look at literature or documentation and things that are not going to involve directly the people you are studying or the getting into their workday or whatever. There are multiple items to measure the same variable on a questionnaire, and a good questionnaire or a good survey is going to be standardized, and standardized means that it has stood the test of time. It has been used over time with different population groups or different subjects, and it's been deemed to be reliable and valid. And when it's that way, we use that as the standard. So that's what a standardized instrument would be. Now, validity. You have face validity, or what we call content validity. That means it appears to be valid. We really haven't tested it or standardized it yet, but on its face, it appears to be valid. And then you have criterion, or what we call convergent validity. Do measures of similar variables correlate? Do you get the same measurement, or do you get the same outcome using other variables that are similar? Discriminant validity. Do measures of non-similar variables show no association? So if I gave you a ACT test to measure your aptitude for college, and then I gave you a ASVAB test to measure your ability to go to the military, and if those two scored high and we use both of those, even though they're not the same test, but we could see that even though the ASVAB, the military test, and the college test are different, there's really no association. So it stands on its own, as the ACT would stand on its own and the ASVAB would stand on its own. But let's say, for instance, you had a job that you wanted a person to fill, and they needed to score high on the ACT or the ASVAB, and they scored high on both, and it was an indicator of success for that company. If both of them could be similar in as much as their tests, then you could say that had criterion validity. Predictive validity: does the variable of interest accurately forecast another variable over time? Again, does the ACT predict over time how successful you will be throughout college? And if it does, then it has predictive validity, and we would want to use that. Well, today we saw the difference between implementation and evaluation feedback, inasmuch as we want to measure our progress along the way of our intervention, but we also want to make sure that we have lessons learned. What worked, what didn't work, why not. We also took a look at the importance of validity and reliability. These are things that are crucial if you're going to have a successful OD intervention, no matter what the setting may be. Well, that's all we have for today, and we'll regroup and get back together tomorrow and continue on with Chapter 9.